How's that? Cool. Cool. So just as an introduction, this talk is a bit of a follow-up to this somewhat unsuccessful panel at the Fifth Hope. Shardy was there. It was, we had about 5 of us, a number of people from 2600 Net IRC and just other random girls who happened to be at Hope. And we basically had this hour-long bitch session about bad experiences that the different members of the panel had had as members of the information security community, as members of the hacker community, or in computer science. And it was really cathartic for all of those of us who were involved, but it wasn't very productive. And so what I want to try and do today is offer some concrete strategies that we can use going forward as a community to encourage the participation of women in the open source and hacker communities, rather than just like whine about how stuff sucks, because that tends to not be so productive. So the first thing I want to address is why you should care. Why you should care about the fact that sitting in this audience there are almost no women. Sitting in the audiences at all of these talks, there have been very few women. This is a problem on two fronts, in my opinion. The first reason that you should care is about the community. And the second reason that you should care relates to people outside the community. As a community, we're missing out on the participation of perhaps the next Linus, or even Kevin Mitnick, who may be not participating because she feels maligned and not able to participate as a member of the community. The flip side to that is that there are people out there who want to participate, who feel that they can't, and who are therefore missing out. As a community, we're missing out, and other people are missing out on our community. My personal experience in being involved in the hacker and open source communities have been very positive, and I feel like an obligation to get other people involved in this and encourage people to participate. So I think that we need to consider the possibility that we're not being true to the ideal of judging people based on their contributions, of being a true meritocracy, if for whatever reason there are no women almost that come to these conferences that participate in the community. What are we doing wrong, and what can we do better? So to get briefly into the question of why there are so few women in this community, I've also been involved in the physics community and the computer science community academically, and I think that there's a lot of overlap of women's experience in these other communities that apply to the hacker and open source communities in terms of why they haven't participated. The biggest one historically has been a lack of role models. There aren't sort of like the figures in the popular media in terms of who participates in our community are generally not women, and that has a major impact on people's involvement and people choosing to get involved in this community. There's a certain amount of, and I don't want to stress this point too much because, again, this gets into being negative, but there's a certain amount of bad behavior that goes on that discourages people who do get involved from continuing to be involved. And I think that that's something I'll address in terms of things to do better. But behavior at conferences, behavior in the workplace, that has a really negative impact sometimes on women's decision to participate or to continue to participate. And one of the really unfortunate things is that women who do choose to participate are more easily discouraged from participating than men, and that exists as a problem both in computer science and physics, and as something that has to be fought actively in the academy, and I think we have to fight it as well from a practical perspective. They've found specifically that in computer science teaching, bad teaching has a has a disproportionately negative impact on women versus male students. And so when trying to get people involved in this community, that's something to consider in terms of when you're teaching and introducing people how to be doing it, and to take an active interest in learning teaching methods. And that contributes to a lot of turnover in the community. I know just from the Toronto 2600 community, the amount of turnover of women participants, even just in the 2 years since I've been involved, is dramatically higher than the turnover of male participants, even just looking at people who show up at meets and attend other related events in the hacker community and open source community. So I wanted to directly go into what we can do about it, and looking at success stories within the computer science teaching establishment and also in physics, and see how we can apply these directly to the hacker, information security, and open source communities. And there's a couple of things that have worked actually really well within. Can you maybe turn that down a little? Thanks. There's a couple of things that have worked really well within the computer science teaching community. There's a study that was done at Carnegie Mellon University between, I think, 1998 and 2003, and it was published in a book called Unlocking the Clubhouse: Gender in Computing. And in those 5 years, they were able to bring enrollment of women from 7% to 42%, and also increase the rate of completion of the program from 20% at the start to 80%, which was the same rate of completion as male students. And they did that by doing a couple of very specific things that encouraged women to start the program in the first place, but also to stick with the program through the 4 years that it takes to get an undergraduate degree. And the Carnegie Mellon model has been applied successfully at other computer science teaching faculties around the world since then. The really specific things that they did in terms of getting people involved were like getting people getting people to consider going into computer science as a major, and which apply sort of generally to getting women involved in technology, is very specific forms of encouragement and mentoring. It was found through this Carnegie Mellon study that women tend to not be into technology for technology's sake, but rather look to direct practical applications of technology. So when you consider that you want to get your friend or your girlfriend or whoever using Linux, rather than being like, look at Linux, it's really cool and open source and you should use it because it's cool, which is true, but at the same time it might be more effective to say, look at Linux is really cool, you could use it to get that old junker computer in your basement working so that your kid can have a computer of their own, or so that rather than having to upgrade your computer, you'll be able to continue using the same one for a while. Sort of specific practical applications of computer science, information security, teaching people about stuff like phishing so that they can protect themselves, rather than just yeah, I'm a hacker, this is really cool, you should get involved. Making that connection from this is an interesting field to these are the specific ways that it can be applied in the real world is the most effective way to get women involved in information security and computer science and the open source community. The metaphor that they used in the Unlocking the Clubhouse study was the idea that women don't dream in code, and I thought that was particularly descriptive of the difference between the idea of doing technology for technology's sake versus actually wanting to have a practical application of it. Having role models for women getting involved and being able to point to specific people in the community who have been doing this for years and do an awesome job of it, and saying, it's not true that there are no female hackers. There's lots of female computer scientists. Grace Hopper, Anita Borg are the two big American examples. The women at Bletchley Park who helped crack Enigma and win the Second World War. There are historically lots of awesome examples of female figures in computer science, and also in the hacker community. You have people like Raven Adler, Val Henson, who's a kernel hacker, and a couple of the women in the Ghetto Hackers. That there are these women out there who are role models, who exist, who have forged the path for other women to follow. And I think the biggest thing that we can do as a community is to hold true to the ideal of the hacker ethic, that hackers should be judged by their hacking and not by their degrees or their job titles, that it's your contribution that makes the difference, and that it shouldn't be assumed that when you're at a conference that you're there as somebody's girlfriend, or that sort of attitudinal problems, that everybody thinks that we don't do it, but maybe you need to call people on it when they do it. So, and that's really helpful. So I didn't have too much other than that to say, and I wanted to open the floor to people's comments and questions about other things that they think might be really positive in terms of getting women involved in this field. And other than that, yeah.
I have a question for you.
What's your question?
So in this study, you said the most descriptive term was that women don't dream in code.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's because of a biological difference of how women are wired different than men, or do you think it's societal and just because of how things have been up to this point?
Well,
do you think that women could dream in code if they were put on an equal footing in terms of society in this field?
It's a really good question, and it's one that's come up in the physics community. I don't remember the name of the dean of, I think it was Harvard, recently. Yeah, Lawrence Summers. There's a big controversy in the physics community over this whole idea that maybe women are just less naturally suited to doing hard science and physics in particular. And I think that there's a lot of that attitude within the computer science community as well. In the Unlocking the Clubhouse study, which was the one at Carnegie Mellon, they found that that a lot of women in the computer science faculty experienced the attitude of, you're only here because you're a girl, like that they had got in because of affirmative action, when it was absolutely not true, and Carnegie Mellon did not do any affirmative action type admissions at the time, and I don't think they do. They still don't, while they have changed their admission policies, and that was part of what made them increase their admission to 43%, they don't actually have any traditional affirmative action type admissions. As to the question of whether it's like, if it's a biological thing, I think that there's very little evidence that this difference in interest has anything to do with biology. One of the things that's sort of like very first year women's studies, equity studies, is the idea that studies that show sameness in the social sciences don't get published. So you very rarely see a study that says, you very rarely see published a study that says, yeah, women and men are just as good at math. You don't ever see that. You only ever see, because there's no the publications like Nature and stuff, they do not have an interest in publishing those studies. It's a pretty well-known fact in the social science research community that those studies don't get published. So there's a slanting towards this idea that there's a biological difference between men and women in terms of mathematical abilities, spatial reasoning, and all those things that lead into being a good computer scientist, when I personally don't feel that that's the case. And there's research into, there's a lot of research into the distribution of intelligence among men and women that show that while intelligence is distributed differently, that the average man and the average woman have the same intelligence. There's just a different distribution along the curve. And again, that brings in questions about how we're defining intelligence and stuff that are kind of out of the scope of this argument. But I think that one of the things that I learned from this Carnegie Mellon study is that even if women who become involved in computer science or the hacker community do not dream in code, that's not the requirement for entry. The requirement for entry is to want to learn cool stuff and do cool stuff. It's not eating, sleeping, and dreaming it. So, does that sort of answer your question?
I was just curious where you stood on it.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that there's no biological thing about men versus women that means that there are like 4 women in this room, so, yeah.
Hi, my name is Bethany Niker. I work for Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science, a full-time staff member.
Awesome.
And I'd like to say, yes, I have dreamed that I was coding.
I totally have too. I've had lots of dreams that involved a lot of Tetris, but and code as well, but point that was made in